This morning we were going to talk a little bit about using hypnosis in the treatment of structural pathology, sort of that fourth paradigm that we talked about yesterday. But before we got to that, I wanted to add some comments to what Reg had talked about yesterday afternoon regarding hypnoanalytic approaches to treating depression. Since I wasn't able to be here, I thought that I would talk about that briefly this morning before we move ahead. And I think one of the ways that I have found particularly useful to think about treating depression is to recognize that unlike what Gertrude Stein said about roses, depression is not depression is not depression. Depressions are a fairly heterogeneous group of syndromes, and even though there has been an effort to differentiate them in descriptive nomenclature using either the ICD or the DSM, I like to take a somewhat more phenomenological approach to thinking about depression because I find that distinction helpful in guiding my treatment. And I like to think of depression as being of four types. The first type I call introjective depression. The second, characterological or helpless-hopeless depression. The third, analytic depression. And the fourth, schizoid or nihilistic depression. And let me say a little bit about the phenomenology of each. I think that what you will recognize from your own clinical work is that as you listen to your patients describe the nature of their depressive symptomatology, one or the other of these phenomenologies will tend to be predominant. For those of you who are psychologists, there are even different characteristics of each of these depressions that can be recognized from the structural summary of the Rorschach, for instance. And this follows a great deal the work of Sid Blatt and his colleagues at Yale, looking at the depressive paranoid continuum and the various representations of this phenomenology on projective testing. But since most of you are not psychologists, I'm not going to talk specifically about the Rorschach. But let's talk a little bit about the clinical phenomenology. Introjective depression is the original description of melancholia from Freud's 1914 paper on mourning and melancholia, in which he talks about the essence of depression as being aggression that has been turned inward, aggression around some loss which the individual has been unable to successfully mourn. And that as this depression is turned inward, what we would think of as being normal mourning or normal grief shifts over to a clinical melancholia. And the characteristic clinical phenomenology of this kind of depression is the result of that aggression which has been turned against the self, sort of a self-denigrating, self-criticizing, guilty rumination. And I think that's an important thing to remember, both for clinical differentiation and for understanding etiology, that we'll come back to in a moment for how it informs treatment. The second kind of depression is very similar to Seligman's learned helpless model of depression. This is a kind of devitalization of the self, which has a central structural component in identity. The person sort of grows up feeling that they do not have power to influence the external world, that they cannot regularly and reliably manage the contingencies of their life. And for that reason, they grow up with a kind of impaired sense of efficacy, an impaired sense of agency, meaning that there is a loss of a sense of control and a loss of anticipation of being able to control not only the external world, but the internal world as well. So very much like Seligman's learned helplessness model. The third kind of depression is what we call analytic depression after the early research by Spitz and his colleagues. And some of you may remember analytic depression. A-N-A-C-L-I-T-I-C, analytic. And this was a term that was coined by Spitz from his work with the failure to thrive children, the children who he described as having marasmus, who were in the orphan homes after World War I, and particularly again after World War II. And although they got food and shelter and so forth, They did not thrive, and some of them, in fact, even died because of the lack of stimulation and the lack of nurturance and the lack of attention. I think most of you are familiar with those early studies. And he sort of described the phenomenology of these children as anaclitic. And so this is a reference to that notion. And the characteristic phenomenology of anaclitic depression is a kind of internal emptiness, a yearning, a longing, which we feel is associated with the early loss of support and nurturance and structure and stimulation. You'd not be surprised, I suspect, to know that there is a kind of developmental prevalence of each of these kinds of depression at each level of structural maturity, with more neurotic or reactive sorts of phenomenologies being characteristic of the introjective depression. The sort of devitalization of the self, the helplessness in the lower neurotic narcissistic spectrum, and the anaclitic internal emptiness and longing being characteristically borderline spectrum in terms of the developmental prevalence of each of these kinds of dysphoria. The fourth type of depression is what I call schizoid or nihilistic depression, seen in lower borderline schizotypal and psychotic range individuals, where the characteristic phenomenology is not only that there is emptiness inside of me, but there's also emptiness in the external world. There's nothing inside, but there's also nothing to yearn for, nothing to long for. And so there is this sense of oceanic despair, this sense of profound emptiness inside and outside that leads to the nihilistic orientation. Okay? Well, if you think about differentiating depression along these phenomenological lines, you can imagine some of the specific hypnotherapeutic interventions which might be indicated for each of them. For instance, for individuals for whom the introjective depression is prominent and predominates the phenomenology, the key issues have to do first with helping them to discharge the aggression which they have been unable to externalize and which was associated with loss, to be able to finish mourning the loss and to reestablish a sense of self-efficacy. Reg, you had a question?
Yeah, what was the diagnostic category associated with the introjective type?
More neurotic range.
Could you just say that line again, please?
Yeah, the sort of developmental predominance.
What do you do right now?
What I just said then. That the characteristic interventions for introjective depression, introjective depression, the one where it's anger turned against the self, is to help the person discharge the anger, finish the mourning process, and restore a sense of self-efficacy. Okay. And I think you can readily, from your previous training, think of some of the characteristic hypnotherapeutic techniques that can be helpful. Oftentimes, it's useful to begin with some hypnoprojective work to clarify for you and interpretively for your patient what is the loss which has not been mourned, which has given rise to the depression, because occasionally, at a conscious level, patients are unable to tell us what the loss has been. And it's important to remember that the loss doesn't have to be a real external object. It doesn't have to be that someone died or someone left or a love affair ended. It can be that some representation of the self has been challenged and shattered by life, or that some fantasy of nurturance or affirmation or evaluation has been lost. Many people, for instance, believe if ever I could be X, if ever I could obtain Y, then I would be loved, then I would be appreciated, then my parents would affirm me. And when they get X or Y and they are not loved, appreciated, or affirmed, there is a profound loss of that fantasy, which is often compensated for earlier losses and help the person to tolerate and to survive in the face of those early losses. So first, some hypnoprojective techniques may be helpful in clarifying the nature of the loss or the fantasies which surround that sense of loss. Then developing some sense of personal resilience in the face of the intensity of aggression can be helpful. Some of the work that we talked about in terms of enhancing self-esteem, and some of the work that Reg talked about yesterday in terms of ego mastery, to help the person create a sense of internal control and stability and empowerment, both by suggestion, by rehearsal and fantasy, and by the experience of exercising control over various aspects of the self during trance, which then can be generalized post-hypnotically by suggestion or by cue. And then moving towards helping the person, in much the way that we might abreact a trauma, be able to focus and discharge the unfinished anger in a way that gives them a sense not only of being able to let go of it, but to experience a sense of mastery over it. And actually, treating this kind of depression, when it's uncomplicated by character pathology, can be relatively brief. And oftentimes I have worked in a 10 to 20 session sort of model using kind of a brief psychodynamic, hypnotically potentiated sort of psychotherapy. Treating the second kind of depression, that depression which we think of as being associated with learned helplessness, is a somewhat more difficult one, because here we're dealing with the fabric of the person's sense of self. This sense of identity as having been devitalized or having been in one way or another impaired in terms of the sense of control over the world. And oftentimes the roots of this are in early developmental experiences of enforced passivity or inconsistency of contingencies, so the person does not internalize a sense that if I do this, that will follow. That leads then to a sense of having power and having control in the world. And so for these individuals, it becomes helpful again, sometimes to do some hypnoprojective work or some dream work to begin to uncover some of the developmental roots of this sense of powerlessness. And then to demonstrate in hypnosis the person's sense of power, again building self-efficacy. And then to move towards work with imagery and suggestion to begin to change the person's sense of self. And we'll talk more about altering the structure of identity after our morning break, because here we're dealing oftentimes with people who are narcissistically organized. So it becomes important not only to learn how to deal with enhancing the underlying structural stability of the self to develop a sense of efficacy, but also to work through the false self-defenses, which are characteristic of narcissistic spectrum individuals. And as I said, we'll talk about the techniques of that following our morning break. Yes?
Was the developmental prevalence for that one, for the third one, was that narcissistic? Or for the
Second one, yes. Yeah, predominantly narcissistic spectrum individuals. For the third type of depression, the anaclitic depression, here the problem is one of internal emptiness and the various defenses against it, including the full range of regressive and dissociative and primitive splitting and projective sorts of defenses that we characteristically encounter in borderline spectrum individuals. And for treating this individual, it becomes necessary to work with the underlying defenses to begin to focus those and repair them. And again, we'll talk about the techniques for that later. But in reality, the treatment of the depression is contingent on their being able to internalize experiences of being nurtured, of being held in a psychological sense, of being understood, of being empathically attuned and contained, and of being valued. In other words, one has to, in one way or another, fulfill that longing, which is accomplished through the development of the therapeutic alliance and the internalization of the experience of the therapist as someone who does understand and who is benevolent and who is caring and supportive and nurturing. In your handout materials, you have a brief step outlined intervention, which is entitled
It contains all three of those.
I don't know if all of you heard the question. The question is, would I say that major depression or a major depressive episode could contain all three of these phenomenological components? And yes, it could. And if it does contain all three of these components, you have what I would think of as a complicated depression, a depression where perhaps a biological predisposition has been elaborated by all these sorts of psychogenic experiences, which then have to be worked through in a hierarchical way, beginning with the most primitive developmentally and moving as the patient accomplishes one to address the phenomenological problems of the next and then the next and so forth. Usually what happens is if you have people who are pre-neurotic in character organization who become depressed, either for psychogenic reasons or because of some biological predisposition to depression, you'll find that they have elaborated phenomenology that would be characteristic of narcissistic and neurotic level depressions as well. But the converse is not true. If you have someone who is neurotic, they may have only a reactive, introjective kind of depression with the phenomenology of guilt, and not that same sense of helplessness or emptiness or nihilism that would be characteristic of the other sorts of depression. But that's a good point. And when you see that sort of complicated depression, that's a kind of cue to you clinically that you probably are dealing with someone who also has a kind of structural arrest prior to the neurotic level. Now, that doesn't mean that the person who comes in complaining predominantly of guilt, of self-denigration, of this kind of aggression turned inward, might not also say something about feeling helpless, feeling powerless in their world. But here, the predominant phenomenology is in one direction. But if you see people where there's kind of equal weight across that phenomenological distribution, then that's a cue to you that you're probably dealing with someone who has a complex depression and probably has some structural arrest at the pre-neurotic level. Yes?
I'm just wondering if you have any more handouts.
I have one handout left, and if you do not get one here, all you need to do is give me your card or something and I'll see that it's sent to you. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, we had more people sign up than we had anticipated. But I have one extra one, and I will give it to someone at the end of the day, but I'm kind of making reference to it to teach with. But if you're wanting to look at that particular handout, which I mentioned, I'll be happy to give that to you. The use of hypnotic imagery with the psychotic patient to establish a positive therapeutic introject.
But, question to the analytic depression. I thought that was with children prior to age 1. I mean, wasn't the babies that weren't held, stuff like that? Was it? How could that be? I don't question what you're saying, but I figured that would be even more in the schizoid area if there was infants that weren't cared for. I mean, people before the time were there.
Yeah, for those of you who didn't hear his question, he thought that Spitz's original work predominantly focused on the impact of this on infants prior to age 1. And in fact, that was true. That was his original use of the word. But the term has been expanded to refer to early loss in the first 3 years of life. So what we're really saying when we describe this phenomenology of internal emptiness and longing is that it has its roots in some sort of deprivation prior to the age of 3. So it's an extension of Spitz's original use of the term.
Thank you. And one more question.
Yeah.
Wouldn't it be likely that under the regression of an illness like depression, a person could jump down the developmental ladder a little bit temporarily?
That's a very good question, and about that there is considerable controversy. Can regression result in destructuralization is really what you're asking. Traditionally in the analytic literature there is a distinction between regression and decompensation. Regression is seen as a deterioration in functioning which is not accompanied by a loss of structural integrity, whereas destructuralization is often called decompensation. In general, for those individuals who stand on the cusp, and you'll understand a bit more about this when I finish my lecture this morning, for those individuals who stand on the cusp with sort of one foot in one level of development and one in another, regression can produce some loss of structure. So for instance, narcissistic spectrum patients who stand with one foot in neurosis and one in the borderline range can regress to look more borderline. And schizotypal patients who stand with one foot in the borderline spectrum and one in the psychotic spectrum can regress to look more psychotic. But for those individuals who are neurotic, even in the face of regression, they will not come to look borderline, because the idea is that the loss of structure does not occur once full object constancy has been consolidated. And let me hold off discussing that further until I present the rest of my lecture this morning. I want to say again, though, that there is some controversy about that. And I follow largely the object relations point of view in people like Kernberg and Rensley, who believe that once one level of structural integrity has been fully achieved, no amount of regression will cause you to fully lose that particular degree of structure or leave that range of structural integrity. Yeah, one last question, then we'll move on.
Okay, can you say something about the decompensation of the schizotypal type of person to a more schizophrenic or schizoaffective?
Yeah, I will as soon as I get to the next lecture. So, I just want to quickly finish off this depression piece from yesterday. And the final bit, the sort of nihilistic depression, this fourth type of depression, for those individuals who are organized in the lower borderline and schizotypal range, involves not only dealing with the internal sense of emptiness, but dealing with the external sense of emptiness. The internal sense of emptiness corresponds to the way that we would treat the analytic depression, with helping the individual to internalize the experience in therapy and to represent it in a way that leads them to have a sense of having been nurtured and fed and supported and valued and affirmed. But dealing with the external sense of emptiness involves first helping the person to establish clear boundaries between inner and outer. So it has to do with boundary stabilization work. And then the management of projective defenses. Because the sense of external emptiness has its origins not only in early disappointment, but in the internal sense of emptiness which the person has attempted to defend against by externalizing it. So there is a kind of projective component to viewing the world as devoid of any potential source of nurturance, gratification, and love that has its roots in an inner world which is empty because of the absence of love. And so we have to unravel the projective component of that kind of nihilistic or schizoid depression before we can help the person mature beyond the point of feeling that not only is there nothing inside, but there is also nothing outside. Okay. So the use of hypnoprojective techniques, the use of a variety of uncovering and dream work to clarify some of the dynamics of the depression, working on issues of self-efficacy, working on issues of aggression management, working on issues of internalizing an analytic introject around which a more resilient sense of self can begin to coalesce, and then working with the structural arrests are components of working with depression depending on where the person falls on the developmental continuum. If you don't mind, I'm going to take off my coat. It's kind of warm in here.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, one question and we'll move ahead.
I conceptualize narcissism as a more primitive problem than borderlineness. Have I missed something important somewhere?
Well, you bring up another interesting controversy in the literature. The historical Kernbergian approach would place narcissism below borderline. Everybody else puts narcissism above borderline. And the empirical research available that I'll allude to shortly, I think, by and large supports the notion that narcissism falls between neurotic and borderline in that kind of developmental model. I'll tell you a little bit more about it. But you can disagree if you want to, because if Kernberg disagrees, then you certainly have the right to. Well, Masterson changed his mind. I had the opportunity about 2 years ago to teach on a symposium with Adler, Masterson, Kernberg, and Wolf. Each of us talking about our own notions about where narcissism falls developmentally. And everyone agreed except Kernberg. So Masterson has changed his mind, I guess.
You didn't tell me.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's change directions here a little bit. And what I would like to do is to give you a year-long course in developmental psychopathology in about 20 minutes. Because in order to understand some notions about working with structural pathology, working with character pathology, it's important to have a kind of conceptual model to guide that work, to give it some sense of direction. And I find it helpful to use a kind of developmentally focused conceptual model that has its roots in ego psychology and in object relations theory. And I'm going to present a kind of integrated, consolidated model which attempts to describe the structuralization of the self and some of the pathology which derives from failures in that structuralization as a function of failures in specific developmental work. And there are several assumptions that I'd like to identify that are central to this model and that you ought to know about from the outset. The first of these is the notion that the development of personality, that the development of structure is epigenetic. And here I'm using the term epigenetic the way it was first used by Piaget, who developed an epigenetic model of cognitive development. And what epigenetic means is that development unfolds in a series of stages that are relatively lawful in any given culture, where success at later levels of development is predicated on success at earlier levels of development. The sort of notion of building blocks, where one goes on top of another. So epigenetic in that sense, a series of evolving stages where success leads to success and failure or partial success leads to later failure and partial failure. The second assumption is essentially an interactive assumption about the nature of character structure. You all may know that Freud's models of the topology of the self largely focused on intrapsychic factors, the distribution of energy, for instance, in this sort of closed internal model. But really beginning with the Neo-Freudians and with every major personality theory since, we've had a more interactive model of the development of personality. That is to say, that the structure of the self derives from experience in the world, which becomes internally represented and then integrated into the emerging fabric of character, into the emerging structure of identity. So that what is inside, this sort of metaphor of personality that we use, is the amalgam of experiences in the world that have become internalized and organized and integrated. Oftentimes, in the language of object relations theory, the internalization is referred to as a representation. And the term representation is used because it has a cognitive component, and so we could call it a memory, but it also has sensory and affective components, so it's more than just cognitive. It's a total unit of experience, which is referred to as a representation. So these representations of experience in the world become internalized and then integrated into the emerging structure of the self. And a useful way to chart this process is a series of developmental events or developmental tasks which are felt to be significant for maturation along any given developmental line. And we could, if we had time, list the central developmental tasks for many different developmental lines. Because the third assumption is that development is multilinear, that there's not just one single line by which all of the capacities of the self matures, but a variety of developmental lines, beginning with Anna Freud's model of development in the late 40s, and with every model of development since then, there has been a multilinear approach to describing maturation, which helps us to understand why in our older child, adolescent, and adult patients, we see some individuals who are relatively mature in terms of some capacities like cognition, intelligence, but relatively immature in terms of other capacities like affect management or identity or capacity for intimacy and interpersonal involvement. It's because these developmental lines, even though at points interconnected and interactive, at other points are relatively independent and so respond differentially to experiences and have different sorts of sequelae as a function of impacts at various points along the line. I tend to be kind of a visual person, and so when I think about development, I like to use the image in my mind of DNA molecules, and you all know how they have all these different strands that at some points sort of intersect and at other points move apart and twist and turn around one another. And I think that's a useful way of conceptualizing the notion that development occurs on these relatively independent lines of maturation. But at certain points, these lines intersect. And these points of intersection or juncture are often called, in the language of developmental psychology, critical periods. And when we use this notion of critical periods to apply to developmental psychopathology, what we're really saying is that there are certain developmental tasks that are so important and so far-reaching that they have sequelae on all the developmental lines, and that those sequelae then become the benchmarks for differentiating one level of structuralization from another level of structuralization, one level of structural maturity from another level of structural maturity. And for purposes of our discussion today, I want to really highlight two of these benchmark critical periods. The first of them, and you may want to follow along in your handout materials, on this chart called the Maturational Continuum of Psychic Structuralization.
Can you slow down one little second?
Uh-huh. And it looks very much like what I've drawn up here on the board for you. Has everybody found that? That's in the first set of handouts that I gave you yesterday morning. Okay. And you may say, well, I thought you said development occurs along a number of developmental lines, and you have only one line. Well, because we're not going to do a whole course and chart all of these developmental lines, I want you to imagine that just for the heuristics of our discussion, we can collapse those lines into one. And in actuality, this would be the line which corresponds most closely to the maturation of the self, to the maturation of identity. Okay? But I want to note for you two important developmental events, two important critical events for the structuralization of the self: object permanence and object constancy. And incidentally, I know that a number of you are quite familiar with developmental psychopathology, and I think you'll hear the contributions here of people like Phyllis Gould and Greenacre and Lovinger and Margaret Mahler and her colleagues Annie Bergman and Fred Pine, the contributions of Althea Horner and Don Rensley, all of which I've sort of integrated here for you. Now, some of you will remember that the term object permanence comes originally from the work of Piaget, where he was referring to cognitive perceptual development. But particularly with Mahler and her colleagues, and to some degree Lovinger and the others, this concept of object permanence was expanded for its significance on all of the developmental lines. And for those of you who don't remember what object permanence is, what Piaget described is that at some point the infant develops the capacity to represent and recognize that objects continue to exist even when they cannot be seen, heard, touched, tasted, or smelled. That is, in the absence of sensory stimulation, there's the ability to recognize and internally represent that something continues to endure, that it is permanent. And in fact, some developmental screening tests, like the Bailey and the Cattell, which are used with youngsters, often involve a test something like taking a rattler and shaking it in front of the baby, and then when the baby is alerted to it, moving it behind the screen and holding it silent, and watching to see if the child looks for it. And those of you who have watched your own children know that there's a point in time where if the rattler goes out of the crib or the ball goes under the couch, it's as if it ceases to exist. But there also comes a point in time where the child knows that the rattler or the ball is still there somewhere and goes to look for it, because they now have developed a sense of object permanence. One more thing that I want to mention to you is that in the constructions of object relations and self-psychology and ego-psychology, there is generally the understanding that for every experience of the object, there's an interconnected experience of self. So the development of object permanence also involves the development of self-permanence, the sense that I endure, okay? That I am permanent, that I transcend time and space even when I am not engaged in a sensory fashion with the other, with the object. Now, object permanence does not mature overnight. It's not that you go to sleep with it one night and you wake up the next morning having it. What happens is that it matures over a period of time, probably somewhere between 3 months of age and 18 months of age is the full maturation of object permanence. And in my model, I have identified 2 anchor points of object permanence. One I call representational, and one I call evocative. We don't need to spend a lot of time on that today, but representational essentially refers to the ability to represent and recognize the permanence and durability of object and self across time and space in the absence of sensory stimulation and in an environment which is emotionally positive or neutral. Okay? Evocative object permanence, that's very much like Piaget's definition. Evocative object permanence, which is the sort of closing anchor point, the closing accomplishment that finishes off object and self-permanence, is the ability to evoke the representation and to use it for self-soothing, defense, and adaptation in an emotionally negative environment. That says, when I'm frightened about being separated from the other, I can evoke the image, the representation of mommy or daddy, and use it to soothe the anxiety or the aggression of being separate. Okay?
The first can't do that?
That's right. Representational only operates in an emotionally positive or neutral environment. Okay? And evocative when the environment is negative, when there's anxiety or aggression, sadness, emptiness, one can evoke that. Well, the important points for understanding object permanence in terms of anticipating our work with patients is to know that the development of object permanence has both structural and dynamic significance. Structurally, once one is able to recognize that things endure and that self endures, that we are permanent across time and space, one can begin to differentiate experiences and organize them or bound them. So the structural outcome of the development of object permanence is the development of the boundaries of the self. The boundaries between inner and outer, the boundaries between self and not self, between self and other, between self as actor and self as object, between inner and outer, between real and not real, and eventually between anxiety and aggression, between happiness and sadness, all of the various boundaries of experience that increasingly are differentiated once this basic capacity for boundary formation is made possible. Now, what this says to us is that when we see patients who have failures in boundaries, either in the differentiation of boundaries, the stabilization of boundaries, the flexibility of boundaries, or the permeability of boundaries, which are the sort of 4 components of boundary development, we know that there are roots back here in the development of permanence. Okay? Just an interesting aside, by the way, those of you who were intrigued a bit by my discussion yesterday morning briefly of transitional objects may find it interesting to know that many developmental theorists believe that moving from representational object permanence to evocative object permanence is naturalistically supported through the infant's use of transitional objects. Okay? The teddy bear that helps to soothe anxiety and being separate. And Winnicott observed that in order for an object to serve a transitional function, it has to have several characteristics. First of all, it has to be a representative or symbolic link to the missing other. It has to be a connector to the missing other, symbolic of them or representative of them in some fashion. It has to contain affect. That is to say that it has to be able to hold, to sort of absorb like a sponge, the anxiety or the aggression of the child. And it has to be available to the child to use autonomously. You can't give a child a teddy bear and say, here, hold this when you miss me. They sort of choose what object they're going to use, and they choose to use it when they wish. And so it becomes the first not self object which the child can independently control. In this fashion, the transitional object supports attachment across space, supports the early neutralization of overwhelming affect, and supports emerging autonomy and independence, the consolidation of a sense of self, control. Not only control of the internal self, the affective and representational world, but control of the external environment, since the child can pick up the teddy bear, can kiss it, can hug it, can throw it away, and the teddy bear does not disappear because of being the focus of that affect or that activity. Doesn't retaliate, isn't destroyed. I think, and we'll come back to this when we talk about technique, I think that part of what is so remarkable about the impact of hypnosis for working with structural arrest in this arena is that, as I said yesterday, hypnosis is itself a transitional space. And in that transitional space, the transferential use of the hypnoanalyst is as a kind of transitional object. And so we can use that transitional space and the internalization of the role of the therapist as transitional object to consolidate object permanence and self-structure, the boundaries of experience for patients who have not been able to accomplish this maturationally, particularly to the degree that that accomplishment was not blocked by organic deficit. The dynamic sequelae, or the developmental sequelae of object permanence, just to finish this up, is the facilitation to engage the developmental work of separation and individuation. That is, as the child feels that he or she can endure and not be overwhelmed by the anxiety or the anger about being separated, they can practice separating. And this is where Mahler's and Levenger's work is particularly informative. That in this practicing separating, the child begins to exercise the muscles of differentiation and exercise the emerging muscles of autonomy. And many of our patients who have difficulties specifically not with differentiation, which has to do with boundaries, but with separation, which has to do with evoking them to manage primitive affect around being separate, and who fall down here in the lower borderline or upper schizotypal spectrum, can benefit from hypnoanalytic interventions which support the practicing through fantasy of being separate and of separating and being autonomous and independent within this transitional space where the therapist as transitional object can contain and hold the intensity of the affect while maintaining as well a sense of connection to important attachments and an emerging sense of mastery over the sense of being separate, the sense of being alone, and the sense of having to handle one's affective state separately and independently. You had a thought or a question, Reg?
I thought you were looking at me.
No.
I wanted to mention that Gus Wick's work, he's got a really lovely piece on this that he had. I was trying to think, I think that it's a chapter in Murray Stein's book, but it's also a separate manuscript.
Yes. Yeah, I had a chance to read that paper before it was published, and it's really a delightful piece of work.
Very nice.
Yeah. Well, let me tell you briefly then about object constancy, and I apologize for going so quickly, but if we don't move along, we're not going to get to the technical stuff here. Yeah?
Yeah, all I was asking was, could you rename the 4 types of boundary problems?
Yeah, the boundary problems, essentially of differentiation, stabilization, flexibility, and permeability. And I listed them in this way because failures in differentiating boundaries, where the individual's boundaries are relatively diffuse, and where there are fears of incorporation and so forth associated with attachment, and problems with a sense of the stability of these across time, space, and affective valence is characteristic of people with failures in representational object permanence. And individuals who have problems with the flexibility of boundaries, with letting them sort of be more tight at some times and less tight at others, or the permeability, letting some things in and keeping some things out, are individuals who characteristically have more problems with evocative object permanence.
Thank you.
Yeah. Just real quickly, object constancy, again a Piagetian term. Some of you may remember it from developmental psychology. And for those of you who don't, let me refresh your memory. What Piaget said about object constancy is it is the ability to represent and to recognize that differing experiences with an object are not experiences of different objects, but different aspects of the same object. Sounds a little bit like how much wood would a woodchuck chuck if a woodchuck would. So let me say it again. Object constancy is the ability to recognize and represent that differing experiences of an object are not experiences of different objects, but simply different aspects of the same object. Okay? Let me give you an example. I can look at this marker from this perspective, and from this perspective, and from this perspective, and from this perspective, and in each case, a different gestalt falls on my retina. But I don't think these are four different things, because I can integrate these different experiences and recognize that they're just different aspects of the same marker. I have, I hope, object constancy. Okay? And like object permanence, object constancy does representational object constancy and evocative object constancy. And here we're talking about something that probably matures between 36 months and 48 months of age. Okay? And representational object constancy refers to the ability to represent and recognize that different aspects of an object are just different aspects of the same object in an emotionally positive or neutral environment. That is, as long as everything is going okay, this more cognitive, perceptual component can operate. But evocative object constancy is the ability to evoke that representation, to use it for self-soothing, for adaptation, for coping and defense in an emotionally negative environment. Okay? So that, let's say, when I'm being spanked by mommy, I can recognize that this is the same mommy who loved me, who fed me, who holds me. And that can help me to manage some of the anxiety and the anger about being punished by this evil bad mommy who's doing that right now. Now, what I think is important for us to hear in the significance of object constancy, again, are a couple of things that have to do with the structural sequelae and the dynamic developmental sequelae of this important structuralizing event. Structurally, object constancy allows us to coalesce, to put together all of these representations and organize them in a unitary, integrated way. What we would say is that this leads to cohesion of our internal world, the integration of identity, the integration of our representational world, to cohesion. That's the structural outcome of object constancy. But with that cohesion, there is an important shift in information processing. Before object constancy, our experiences are represented in terms of their affective valence. When things make us feel good, they're represented as good things. And when things make us feel bad, they're represented as bad things. But because the same things can make us at different times feel good and feel bad, what we have are splits in the representations of these external objects or others. We have good objects and we have bad objects, okay? And so in our inner world, if we could imagine, we have a series of positive experiences and a series of negative experiences. The schemata organizing them are the schemata of their affect which they evoke, okay? But at the point that our brain matures, that our cognitive apparatus matures, if our environment has been facilitating and supportive, then we can put these together. This can now be organized in terms of mother, and this can now be organized in terms of father. And this can now be organized in terms of sister, not in terms of the affect which is evoked. That is to say, we shift from information processing that is affectively mediated to information processing which is symbolically or linguistically mediated. Things are organized now not on the basis of how they make us feel, but some symbolic representation of their external stimulus value by their momminess. And all of our experiences of mommy are put together. And by their daddiness, and all of their experiences of daddy are put together. And by their brotherness, or their treeness, or their puppiness, or whatever. Okay?
Give an example, just one.
Well, that's the example. That the mommy who hurts us and the mommy who feeds us are not seen as two separate mommies, but we put them together and they're different aspects of the same mommy. Okay? And the daddy who abandons us and the daddy who holds us are not seen as two separate daddies, organized by good and bad. They're put together in their daddiness. Okay? What we're really talking about here is a shift from primary process thinking to secondary process thinking, from thinking that is affectively mediated to thinking that is symbolically or linguistically mediated. Okay? So with this cohesion of self, with this integration of identity, with this putting together of our representational world, there is this shift from affectively mediated process to symbolically mediated process. And the second developmental dynamic significance which occurs is that this now facilitates the developmental work of individuation. And here I'm using individuation in an Ericksonian sense, not Milton Erickson, but Erik Erikson, which means the ability to freely and fully express and actualize the potential of self. Individuation. So, object permanence leads to boundaries and to the development of an engagement with separation and independence related work. Object constancy allows for cohesion of identity, a shift from primary to secondary process thinking, and the ability to engage the developmental work of individuation. Okay? Now, one of the things that you readily, I think, can see here is that prior to object constancy, we have a naturalistic splitting of our internal self and object representations. Prior to age 3 to 4, children do naturally split their internal representations as a function of how they make them feel. But once the capacity for constancy matures, you may wonder why do some individuals still maintain what we then come to call defensive splitting in Kernberg's terms. Because, and this is a fairly simplified explanation, but it's one that I find useful. If you have lived in a happy, nurturing, benevolent environment, when it comes time to put together, to coalesce these internal representations, you either have equality between positive and negative experiences, or hopefully a surplus of positive ones. So that once the cohesion occurs, you're left with feeling that there are good things inside me, I'm a pretty good person, and there are good things in the world. The world is a benevolent place. That is, the outcome of this structural event will be the production and maintenance of a sense of internal and external security. But what if you have lived in a world which has been filled predominantly with negative events, with malevolence and deprivation and trauma and loss and hunger and abuse and poverty? When the time comes to put these together, were you to do so, what you would be left with is a sense of internal emptiness, anxiety, and badness in a world which is threatening and overwhelming. Who wants that? So the splitting is now maintained defensively, so that at least some of the time one can evoke a sense of internal or external goodness, that there can be these small oases of security and comfort in an otherwise threatening and overwhelming world.
Well, it's also Gerald Adler's exposition of borderline, yes.
Exactly. It relates to many different people's exposition of borderlineness, and I think that what is one particular piece of work that I find very useful here that you might find interesting if you like thinking in this way is the work of Vamek Volkan, V-O-L-K-A-N, who is originally a Turkish psychiatrist. And the book is Primitive Internalized Object Relations. Volkan is his name, Vamic Volkan. Primitive Internalized Object Relations. It's a wonderful book, published back in 1976 by International Universities Press. But it's really an excellent book for describing the relationship between the internal representational world and specific aspects of psychopathology. But what I think you have already anticipated is that by simply looking at these two central developmental events, we can describe several different levels of psychological structure, several levels of structural maturity. For those individuals who have not developed at least representational object permanence, who do not have differentiated boundaries, who have a kind of diffuseness and confusion about what's inside and what's outside, about what's me and what's not me, about what's real and what's not real, we can say that they fall in the psychotic range of development. Okay? For individuals who have accomplished object permanence, who have differentiated and permeable boundaries, but who who have begun to engage the work of being separate, but who have not been able to coalesce a stable, integrated internal world and reliably use secondary process thinking, we say they fall in the borderline spectrum. Okay? And for those individuals who have both object permanence and object constancy, and for whom the work of individuation is the central developmental task, we say they fall in the neurotic to mature spectrum. But you'll notice a couple of groups that are quite interesting, that have become of particular interest in the last 15 years, because they actually fall on the cusps, and these are the people I was alluding to earlier. There's some individuals who have partial object permanence, that is to say, that they have representational but not evocative permanence, meaning that as long as the external environment is positive or neutral, they look as if they are borderline. But in the face of negative affect, they cannot evoke the stability of boundaries. They cannot evoke a sense of control in managing those boundaries. They cannot evoke and hold on to a stable sense of their durability and their permanence and their security in being separate. And so they look more psychotic. And these people fall in the schizotypal range. Okay? And on the other end are those individuals who have partial object constancy. As long as the environment is positive and is not challenging or anxiety-provoking, they can look as if they are neurotic. But in the face of environmental insult and a rise in internal anxiety and aggression, they cannot hold on to that sense of integrity, that sense of cohesion, and they look transiently more borderline. And these are the people who fall in the narcissistic spectrum. And the reason that I think a number of people have moved to putting the narcissistic patients up here is not only that this conceptual model makes a lot of clinical sense, but we now have about a decade of empirical research which has tested, do people who get a particular diagnosis demonstrate object permanence and object constancy? And what we've found is that narcissistic patients, patients who get narcissistic character disorder diagnosis and other narcissistic spectrum disorders, reliably can be demonstrated to have object permanence, but not to have full object constancy. And they do have a greater degree of object constancy, that is at least the representational, than do borderline spectrum patients. And it's interesting that in response to this research, what Kernberg has said, and Masterson too, because they initially put the narcissistic spectrum disorders down here at the bottom of the borderline range, using narcissism more in a Freudian way, meaning essentially autistic or self-absorbed, lacking a capacity for object relatedness. Okay? Is that they have said, well, there are two kinds of narcissism. There is what we will call, in Kernberg's language, malignant narcissism. And malignant narcissists in Kernberg's system are really schizotypal. Whereas non-malignant narcissists fall here between the neurotic and the borderline spectrum. And if we had time, we could take all of the DSM-4 disorders, all of the personality disorders, and put them on this developmental spectrum, because there is now some research which largely comes out of Yale, Michigan, and Rhys Davis. And if any of you are interested, I would be happy to give you some references, using the Rorschach, the TAT, the early memories tests, some IQ measures, some structured interviews, to differentiate the presence of partial and full object permanence and the presence of partial and full object constancy. And using that operationalized empirical data then, placing all of the axis 2 diagnoses along this continuum. So, as you would expect, the narcissistic character disorder proper is in the narcissistic spectrum. The borderline personality disorder proper is in the borderline spectrum, and the schizotypal personality proper is in the schizotypal range. But we also have other kinds of personality structures which fall in here. For instance, the avoidant personality, which falls right here in the upper borderline spectrum, or the sociopathic personality, which falls right in here in the lower narcissistic range, or the old notion of the explosive personality, who falls right here in the schizotypal range. And if any of you are interested in that, I know that some of you are not here for a course in psychopathology, but if any of you are interested in that, just let me know by writing on a slip of paper, and I'd be happy to send you some of my papers and charts and so forth that I use that explicate that more fully. Yeah, Rich?
Would you mention passive-aggressive on the diagram?
Sure. Where would you guess the passive-aggressive falls? Any guess?
To the right.
To the right, that's right. Passive-aggressive personalities fall in the upper narcissistic spectrum. They look as if they're good and compliant. Their false self is organized around that compliance. But the anger around unmet dependency needs, which is the organizing dynamic of the false self, becomes clear and is disorganizing, moving the patient to look more borderline and labile and disorganized as that false self is penetrated. So passive-aggressive personalities fall in the upper narcissistic spectrum. Okay. But for purposes of our discussion today, what I wanted to really point out to you with some conceptual underpinning is that when we look at structural arrest, that is, when we look at those individuals who, because of organic deficit or biological predisposition, which is probably predominant down here, or because of psychogenic factors like trauma and loss and inconsistency of family system and so forth, have not been able to fully accomplish the developmental tasks of object permanence and object constancy. We're really looking then at failures which have broad developmental significance in terms of cognitive functioning on that line of development, in terms of affect regulation and impulse control on that line of development, in terms of body image and relationship to somatosensory experience on that line of development, in terms of identity formation, in terms of capacity for interpersonal involvement, in terms of moral development. On each of these developmental lines, these failures have important maturational sequelae. And so when we're looking at patients who present in our office with symptoms deriving from those kinds of developmental arrests, what we can begin to do is to think for ourselves, how can we help finish the work of structural maturation by helping the person finish the unfinished developmental business? And this has been the sort of shift in hypnoanalytic technique in the past 10 or 15 years, really beginning about 1980, is how could hypnosis be utilized to bring into focus this developmental work and to help the person then to internalize and finish the developmental tasks which would give rise to incremental increases in the structuralization of the self, around specifically problems with object permanence for psychotic, schizotypal, and lower borderline patients, and problems with object constancy for upper borderline, narcissistic, and lower neurotic spectrum patients. Okay. The model which I have proposed, again, takes advantage of some of those curative factors of hypnotic trance that we talked about yesterday. The fact that we can use hypnosis to focus attention, that we can use hypnosis to kind of move across the boundaries, the transitions of consciousness, of experiencing, of representation, that we can evoke experience as well as the imagery which elaborates and symbolizes it, and that we can give this meaning in the same way that we can give the meaning that as your arm gets heavier, you'll go deeper into trance, or the meaning that as you rub your hand on your belly, the pain will go away. We can also give the meaning that the experience that we're creating, which is developmentally focused, as it is internally represented and integrated, given meaning, can change the person's sense of differentiation, or control over the boundaries of self, or ability to represent experience in a symbolically mediated way, or to integrate disparate experiences of self and other into one cohesive representation, which leads to identity integrity. And to do this, I tend to follow a kind of developmentally evocative model, which I think recapitulates the normal course by which these experiences in the world are accrued, internally represented, and integrated into emerging structure. If you watch youngsters, if you watch infants, early on they're very much involved in exploring the world in a sensory proprioceptive way. And if the sensory perceptual apparatus is intact, they will garner together a whole lot of experiences and then bring them inside, internally represent them, and across time organize these in first differentiated and then integrated fashions. So what we want to do in hypnosis is to sort of parallel this process, to recapitulate it as we can. And so I've developed a 4-step intervention paradigm for working on structural pathology that begins first with a diagnostic formulation about the level of the developmental arrest. As you listen to your patient, you want to try to find out where are they structurally. And one of the things that may be helpful for you, which I included in your handouts, is a chart entitled Phenomenological Aspects of Differing Levels of Characterological Maturity. And I know this is also in the material that Reg gave you yesterday. But what I attempt to do here is to describe for you the characteristics for individuals at each of these different levels of development. What is, as you listen to them clinically, as you observe them in your therapy room, you listen to how do they think, not just the content of thought, but the quality of thought processes. How do they manage their affect? What's the quality of their interpersonal relationships? What's the quality of their self-representation, their identity? What are the significant defenses? And all of the individuals organized at a particular structural level will share in common certain phenomenological features. And many of you can already hear these as you listen to your patients. We can also see them on Rorschachs and MMPIs and TATs and structured interviews in a variety of different ways if we want to examine them more psychometrically. But first you want to begin with that developmentally based formulation of your patient. This person who I see, who's coming to me with a problem with impulse control, who is periodically mutilating himself, who gets confused at times, who lives his life as a kind of dot-to-dot diagram with one point of affective intensity shifting to another point of affective intensity with no lines, no map to connect one line to another. This person who is overwhelmed by the need to act out has those problems because of a failure in developing constancy. There is no cohesion to link together these different affectively charged experiences. No constant, stable intensity. And so they're all over the map. Obviously, we're talking about someone who is a borderline personality. One of the sort of characteristic hallmarks of borderlines is that they are stably unstable. because they don't have that structural constancy to give containment to their affect or to give structure to the pattern of their lives, or to give cohesion to their sense of self, or to give a secondary process quality to the information processing. So they show splitting, and they show lability, and they show impulsivity, and all those other sorts of things that we see. So listen to your patient. In addition to whatever you may diagnose them on DSM-4, determine where they are structurally. Okay, where do they fall developmentally? Are they narcissistic spectrum? Are they borderline spectrum? Are they schizotypal spectrum? Are they psychotic spectrum? And then as we begin to intervene hypnotherapeutically, we can use hypnosis to evoke and work on the unfinished developmental tasks in this sort of four-step measure that I would describe. The first step is to focus at a sensory motoric level some developmentally evocative intervention. Okay? Let me give you an example. Let's say that you have a patient who you want to be able to experience control over their boundaries. Okay? We're working down here on the first half of object permanence. The sense that their boundaries are stable and that they can control them. Okay? You might have them develop an arm catalepsy. Okay? And to focus on that sense of power and strength that defines the boundaries and the phenomenology of their arm. To evoke that experience, and then to be able to relax it, and to regain it, and to relax it, and to regain it. And you can see how metaphorically and evocatively that action not only attends to the notion of internal boundaries, but evokes things like raising and lowering a window, opening and shutting a door, this notion of holding things tight or letting things be loose, the various components of flexibility and permeability, which will be the later developments in boundary integrity. So the first step is at a somatosensory level, the same way that infants begin to accrue this experience developmentally with these sort of sensory anchors. Okay? We develop an evocative, maturationally focused experience. Okay? The second step is the internal representation of that experience in a consensually validated fashion. That is, that in a way that you and the patient both construct and agree on, this experience is internally represented, first eidetically, and then elaborated metaphorically. And what I mean by eidetically is that you want the person to see, to visualize first, seeing their arm get stiff, and then be able to relax it, and feeling it get stiff, and then be able to relax it, and seeing it get stiff, and being able to relax it, while maintaining a sense of comfort and calm and security. And if the person is unable to do that, then you can actually allow them to open their eyes and look at it, and then in a more directly eidetic way, close their eyes and reproduce it in imagery internally. And then open their eyes and look at it, and close their eyes and reproduce it internally, until they can do that spontaneously and comfortably. Okay? And then we want to elaborate some of the more metaphoric and symbolic aspects of this, having them imagining opening and shutting doors, locking and unlocking windows, testing the strength and solidity of the walls and the doors and the windows, or various containers of their life. Okay. So a series of guided images, since the early forms of representations are felt to be essentially visual images and hallucinations. Okay. The third step, after we have a developmentally focused sensory motor experience and the internal representation of that, first eidetically and then metaphorically, is that we want symbolization and meaning. We want to give this experience meaning as a way of beginning to elaborate its internal integration. What this really means is talking about it, giving words to it, talking about the meaning of it in trance as well as external to trance. Saying things like, and just the way that you can experience your arm becoming stiff when you want it to be stiff and relaxed when you choose for it to be relaxed, you can choose to open doors and close doors, open windows or close windows. That's your choice, that's your control, that's your arm, that's your strength, that's your stiffness, that's your relaxation. All of it is a part of you. And in the same way, each time you feel your arm hanging there by your side, it can be a reminder of that enduring strength inside of you to make things tight and closed and locked when they need to be, or open, relaxed, and flexible when that feels safe enough for you to choose to do so. Okay. So you're giving words to it, you're elaborating it, and not only do you talk about it, you can have the patient imagine talking about it, writing about it, describing it in words, putting it on a blackboard, writing it on a paper, putting it in a letter, telling it to a friend. Now, what we're really doing here is that we not only are practicing the symbolization of this experience as we move it towards a full secondary process representation, but also, as we'll talk about after the break, we are neutralizing the affect around this experience, which has its roots in early trauma or loss, which prevented this development from occurring in the normal maturational fashion. And by neutralizing that affect, we're helping the person to exercise this capacity and to develop this structure more completely and more freely. I'll talk about this a lot this afternoon, and also technically right after we have our break. But the process of affect neutralization, which I find is most helpful to follow, is based on Hartman's work, which outlines 4 steps of affect neutralization, the third of which is symbolization. So what we're really doing here is we're symbolizing, we are giving meaning, and we're sort of intersecting with the affect neutralization work as we attempt to bind and hold and modulate and shift the affect associated with feeling that one can't control boundaries, that one can't be stiff and tight and locked enough to keep the dangerous, toxic things out, that one can't control the containing functions of one's environment, either internally or externally, that closeness to anything promises threatening and risky intrusiveness. Okay? And the final step, after we have done developmentally focused experience, internal representation, symbolic elaboration, giving meaning, the third step is integration. We use directed fantasy rehearsal so that the person can experience exercising this function across time, different periods of time. We can do age regression, so they imagine doing it at different ages, or age progression, so they anticipate doing it into the future teleologically. Across space, in different environments, both relational environments and geographic environments. And across changes in affective valence, when they're feeling strong, when they're feeling happy, when they're feeling content, when they're feeling anxious, when they're feeling sad, when they're feeling angry, when they're feeling sexy, when they're feeling empty. That they be able to imagine seeing themselves opening and shutting doors. Letting a cool breeze in, which I wish we could do, by opening a window.
Have you been working?
Well, I don't know whether it doesn't seem to me to be working, but we can hallucinate that it is.
I hallucinate fixed.
And exercising these across changes in affect. That way consolidating not only the representational, but the evocative component of boundary stabilization. Okay? Now then, let me tell you that when patients do this, they can't always just go through these steps 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That is, they won't be able to do part of it, or they'll get anxious, or the image will shift. And what they're telling you is that this is still too scary. So you have to stop the imagery work at that point. Explore what's going on. Restore a sense of control and a sense of comfort and security, and then re-engage the imagery work in much the way that we would do progressive relaxation in the service of desensitization paradigm. Okay? So we're really, in some sense, desensitizing the anxiety around acknowledging, experiencing, and owning these capacities of the self. Sometimes individuals can't hold a sense of self that is recognizable across changes in space and time and affective valence. So they have to begin with sort of a part self representation, much the way we talk about part object representations. They may be able to only see their hair, and by their hair recognize that is still me. Or sometimes it's not even a body part. Maybe it's a piece of clothing or a particular colored scarf or their old teddy bear or other transitional object, which then can be not only the cue for restoring comfort and the cue for consolidating representation, but the post-hypnotic cue for re-evoking that sense of mastery and control and security external to trance as people rehearse between sessions what's going on. Let me also say that doing this work is anticipatory to the metabolism of it, which must occur in waking therapy. That is to say, once you have worked on this piece of structure, on let's say boundary stabilization, and you've gotten at least as far as the symbolization component, and you're beginning to work on the integration component, you can then begin to suggest that this is brought into waking therapy by remembering or by dreams or simply by suggestion, that the patient now work with this in a waking state. And then what you can do is that you can explore how this has given meaning for the patient and begin to do the genetic uncovering in waking therapy about what were the historical events which produced this developmental failure. What has been the impact of this on historical relationships? What has been the impact of this on contemporary relationships? How will this new capacity of the self impact the relational world in the same way that we would do working through with other kinds of patients? But what we're really saying is that before we can do that kind of verbal processing, that metabolism of this experience, we have to build the experience for patients who do not have that maturationally and structurally available when they have been arrested at a pre-neurotic or pre-object and self-constancy level of development. Now, people often ask me, do you really think that this kind of developmentally evocative sensory focus, with its internal representation and elaboration with imagery and words, changes psychic structure? I don't know. My guess is that it probably doesn't. I think that what changes psychic structure is the relational matrix which is built around this. That is to say that what you're really doing is that you are constructing an interactive, interpersonal event that has a particular target, and you are employing this event to evoke developmentally sensitive phenomena, which are then processed both in hypnotic consciousness and in waking consciousness, at the level of the body, sensation, and at the level of mental representation, at the level of affect, and at the level of cognitive symbolization, in reference to one's history and within the construction of contemporary reality, vis-a-vis genetic objects and vis-a-vis contemporary objects, including and most importantly the therapist. And it is this sort of working with the interpersonal construction as it is internalized in an environment which is supportive and consistent and benevolent and accepting and encouraging of growth rather than threatened by and discouraging of maturation, that I believe really changes psychic structure. The same thing that changes psychic structure in waking psychotherapy, but this has the advantage that you don't wait for these developmentally sensitive issues to emerge solely through the patient's acting out or regression or associational strength. You can now move the therapy forward in a more planful, developmentally stepwise fashion. And that speeds up the work of therapy, which becomes very, very important when you're dealing with patients arrested at these levels of maturation who might normally require 10, 15 years of 2 or 3 or 4 times a week of psychotherapy to establish full object and self-constancy. Can now do that work in a couple of 3 years. In my experience, I have probably shortened by half the amount of time it takes me to work with borderline and narcissistic patients since I have begun integrating these sort of developmentally focused hypnotic interventions auxiliary to therapy. But what I think is also very important is that one of the problems with doing traditional analytic treatment with pre-neurotic patients is that when this material presented itself, there was so much anxiety and affective intensity and regression around it that it was very difficult to examine it. Most of the time we were managing it, and there was a great deal of turmoil, really, as people attempted to apply the analytic model to working with pre-neurotically arrested patients because they could not tolerate and did not have the observing ego capacities to do that kind of only verbally mediated containment of their experience. Here what we have done is that we have constructed experiential containers for our patients prior to beginning the more uncovering, exploratory, interpretive aspects of the work, which consolidates and is necessary for change. And remember, this is one of those points where I would make reference to the difference between hypnoanalytic work and Ericksonian work. That is to say, that here we're saying it's very important to bring this material into consciousness, to process it, to explore it, to understand it, to integrate it consciously. Whereas someone who was working more Ericksonian-wise might not do that. But if you think a little bit about Erickson's work with his sicker patients, patients like, let's say, the February man, who probably was schizotypal, although a lot of Erickson's case reports, unfortunately, are complicated by being confounded often or apocryphal often. But the February man probably was schizotypal. And one of the ways that Erickson worked with him is that he saw him several times, and then he saw him periodically for the rest of his life. He sort of constructed a transferential container to support this man across time. But what we're really talking about here is really consolidating the internal structure of the patient, not building a relational container to hold someone as we would in supportive therapy alone, but helping that structure to be internalized for maturation so the person can get finished with therapy and go on with their lives. Another question that people often ask me is, do you really think that with this process you can take someone who's schizotypal and turn them into a good, high-functioning, neurotic, mature patient? And the answer is probably no. With people who are arrested down here, there probably are some significant, if not organic factors, then at least predispositions that have interfered with their cognitive perceptual apparatus. So it couldn't mature in the way that would allow them to explore and internally represent and organize and integrate the experience of life. And when that gets elaborated by a negative environment, well, it's even worse. But you can take many patients in here and move them up here. And you can take people in the borderline spectrum and move them to the lower neurotic range. And you can take narcissistic people and with treatment, move them to the healthy, mature range. What you're really saying for people down here, if you move them up here, is that you're helping them to build a more adaptive false self, the way that narcissistic patients have them. That can help them get along in the world and create some stability in the face of whatever biological predisposing factors they have to contend with. Well, we have a couple of minutes before break, so let me see if you have some questions you'd like to ask me because we've covered a year's course. Yes?
Are you implying by this model that after the establishment of full object constancy, the splitting that results in DID would be impossible?
Well, that's a wonderful question, and yes, that's what I'm implying. I've gotten into at least a dozen, I don't know if I would say controversies, that's probably too nice a word, but I've had a lot of discord with people like Kluft and Bennett Braun and Rich Horowitz, all of whom have done research, largely based on clinical interview and symptom checklists, where they say that there's clear evidence that some individuals who have DID are neurotic spectrum. But I, in a couple of occasions, was able to go back and they gave me the opportunity to examine those same individuals. And on projective test, and by using these measures of object permanence and object constancy, they in fact were down here. That is, they looked as if they were neurotic because they were narcissistic. As long as some of their, at least some of their alters had narcissistic false selves, they could maintain at least some of the time what looked like a neurotic presentation.